Good afternoon. My name is Kiasha Moore, and I'm a member of the Business and Trade team. Two of our group members, Sarah Nechtel and Sophia Kittler, could not be here, but they were an integral part of our research. Our group decided to explore how the potential economic effects of the forthcoming U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement would impact small and medium enterprises. Although the free trade agreement was signed in 2006 during the Bush administration, it was held up in Congress for several years. So it was finally passed in October 2011, and President Obama then signed it. Most of the provisions of the FTA are set to take effect by August 2012, and the act makes permanent the provisions that Colombian exports have in U.S. markets, and it reduces all tariff protections on goods imported into Colombia within the next 5 years. And with the impending reduction in trade barriers due to the forthcoming FTA, we were fascinated by the potential impact on small and medium enterprises. This area of research is particularly important because SMEs are an integral part of the Colombian economy. This is witnessed by a study done by the World Bank in 2003 that estimated that SMEs provide approximately 67% of employment in Colombia and make up 29% of the GDP in Colombia. So Naveen will now go into the challenges of the economic environment and how these challenges particularly impact SMEs.
Thanks, Kiasha. So I'll just go into some background on some of the continuing challenges in the Colombian economy that disproportionately impact the SME sector. First and foremost is the high rate of income inequality. Colombia is notorious for having the highest rate of income inequality in Latin America, and it's only worsened really in the past decade. The Gini coefficient has risen from 0.51 in 2000 to 0.587 in 2009, and so things have definitely gotten worse. But another persistent plague is underdevelopment of infrastructure. Colombia's infrastructure network ranks 79th out of 139 countries surveyed by the World Economic Forum recently. So really roadways and other modes of transport are severely lacking and put a large impediment on industry. And a fact that we heard repeated many times by different policy experts, it's an anecdote that we kind of heard ad nauseum about that kind of puts into perspective the transportation challenges, is that the cost of shipping a container of goods from China to a port in Colombia is actually less than it is to ship the same container of goods from the port city to one of the interior cities like Bogota. So that really puts things in perspective. Another issue is problems with the education system. The barriers in the education system have led to low levels of skilled labor. And while there have been reforms in the elementary and secondary system, recently there are still major gaps in the post-secondary and vocational training systems, which have exacerbated income inequality. Another issue is the tax burden placed on businesses in hiring new workers, which have disproportionately impacted SMEs. We're talking about the payroll taxes that fund Colombia's social safety net. They're disincentive both to hiring new workers and also for businesses in the informal sector to formalize. Another major issue is limited access to capital and financial services. Colombia's microfinance sector has been very constrained in its expansion to the interior regions and to underserved regions on the coast. Another issue is the historical economic protections and barriers to trade, which Kiasha mentioned before. Colombia's industries have been heavily protected until recently with tariff levels of up to 14%. So it's led to many industries being inefficient and ill-prepared to really deal with the impending competition from foreign markets. And this leads into the last point, which is barriers to the export market for the SME sector. So SMEs have traditionally lacked both the know-how and the means to be able to export to foreign markets. So with all of that in mind, with this challenging economic environment, we set out to understand sort of what the landscape of policy is today and what potentially can be done to enhance competitiveness prior to the FTA implementation. So In terms of some of our key meetings, we had a series of meetings with representatives from government, from multilateral organizations, and from the private sector. But just to highlight some of the key meetings, we met with Mauricio Reyna from an economic think tank called FedDesarrollo. Mauricio served as the Vice Minister of Trade under the Uribe administration, and he assisted in negotiating the free trade agreement. So his insight on the potential impact of the FTA was invaluable. We also met with ProExport, which is the Colombian government's export promotion agency, to better understand the government's services in training small and medium-sized enterprises on how to export. We also met with CREAME, which is a network of business and entrepreneurship incubators in Colombia that focus on entrepreneurial training. And finally, we met with a representative USAID to discuss the microfinance sector in Colombia and the challenges that it faces. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff now to discuss our policy findings.
Great, thank you, Naveen. So we're going to do a quick overview of the state of current policy in Colombia, starting with capacity building and looking at Expopyme. Expopyme was founded in 1999, and it was managed by ProExport, which Naveen mentioned. We met with a representative from the organization. And Expopyme was funded by the government. They worked with SMEs from all sectors of the economy who had aspirations for internationalization, and they helped these SMEs to design and then implement the export plans. Since 1999, Expopyme worked with over 2,500 small businesses across the country until funding was cut in 2011. The government reshifted its priorities and said that Expopyme had not delivered enough measurable results in the categories of job creation and small business growth. To sort of supplement what Expopyme was doing through ProExport, the national government also established the Transformación Productiva, which really focused on specific industries that the government was trying to prioritize for internationalization in places where they felt that they had a strategic competitive advantage in the global marketplace. So trying to be a bit more strategic and focused in where the resources were being spent. However, this particular organization didn't have the same level of depth in terms of the support that it provided for the individual SMEs. On the finance side, we researched quite heavily Bancoldex, which is a state-owned bank. It was founded back in the early 1990s as the main import-export bank for the government of Colombia. It was rechartered in 2003 with an additional focus on the SME and building the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Colombia. Bancoldex provides financing for capitalization, FTA assistance, and working capital. And finally, as Naveen also mentioned, the microfinance sector traditionally has been pretty small and underdeveloped in Colombia, mostly because of a fairly low usury rate, which is the maximum interest rate that banks are allowed to provide. It had been as low as 20% in the late 1990s. It's risen up to 50% recently. However, that's allowed for greater expansion in urban cores like Bogota and Cartagena, Medellin, but in more rural areas where transaction costs are significantly higher, there has not been as much market penetration, and microfinance is still not really a viable option for most SMEs looking for capital financing. In addition, Naveen mentioned sort of some of the educational challenges that are happening in Colombia and limitations on the workforce side. Since 1957, the federal government has worked through SENA, which is officially the Servicio Nacional de Aprendizaje, sort of a worker training program. And in last year, they trained 5.7 million Colombians in technical skills needed in the labor market. So there is some effort going into this. However, 5.7 million workers in a country where there are well over 40 million people, many of these workers lack the skills necessary to move into the jobs that are coming online due to the FTA. There needs to be more emphasis placed here. And similarly with entrepreneurial incubation, we, as Naveen also mentioned, met with someone from CREAME. CREAME is really focused on, first of all, it was founded in Medellin in the late 1990s by a sort of a conglomeration of academics, government officials, and business sector folks. And their goal really was not just to provide traditional business incubation services, but also to provide specifically export training services at 3 different levels: basic, specialized, and in-depth, depending on the stage of business. and also seminars to really help SMEs get the skills that they need as they're building out their business plan to understand what it takes to incorporate an export plan into it. So based on everything that we learned, we came up with 4 main recommendations. And keep in mind that the framework behind this is all about integration. We feel like there's a lot of great things happening, especially since Uribe and Santos have taken office in the last 10 years in the national government. Lots of great things have been happening, but they've been sort of siloed. And we think that integrating a lot of these efforts will be very impactful in terms of deepening impact. So first, financing startup and expansion costs. Integrate the great work that Benkeldex is doing in with some of the great things that Transformación Productiva is doing, and it will become more of a one-stop shop for small businesses looking for financing. Also, continue to raise the usury rate on microloans, especially in rural areas, as long as you couple that with increased regulation so that you don't have to worry about predatory lending. In parts of Southeast Asia, you have interest rates going as high as 70 or 80%, and you still have a thriving environment for microfinance, as long as you have the necessary protections to ensure that predatory lending is not taking place. Moving on, workforce development, I already touched on this, strengthening SENA, making sure that they're reaching out into the rural areas and specifically working with dislocated populations who've been affected by all the conflicts out in the rural areas. Third, working on the entrepreneurial incubation network. Continue to invest in CREAME. There are currently 30 sites where they're working around the country. There needs to be more. And also integrating into these networks seed capital funding, so that it's sort of, if you go through the CREAME network, you get a seal of approval, and banks are able to lend more easily, knowing that you have the skills and resources that it takes to successfully grow a business. And finally, assistance in navigating global markets. Specifically, extend the great work that ProExport's been doing into underserved markets, and continue to educate the small businesses on what it takes to be competitive globally, so that when the FTA does begin to come online in August of this year, we'll have an SME sector that is prepared for the implications of what that means and able to take advantage of the opportunity that it presents.